At about 7,800 meters on K2, the plan looked clean. Multiple teams had agreed to move as one. They would share the route and the ropes. Around 18 to 25 climbers prepared to leave Camp Fool. It was just before midnight on July 31st, 2008. The advance group would fix lines through the bottleneck early. Main teams would follow fast and summit by early afternoon. They planned to descend safely in clear daylight. It sounded controlled, efficient, and highly professional. But the first crack appeared before the push even began. Key rope fixers were already struggling on the mountain. High-altitude porter Shaheen Baig had to descend. He was suffering from severe altitude sickness. Another porter also turned back ill that day. Jahan Baig stayed at Camp the Third feeling unwell. He was expected to help lead the fixing effort. Before anyone touched the upper slopes, the margin shrank. K2 does not forgive shrinking margins. From Camp 4, the route rises directly toward the bottleneck. This is a narrow, incredibly steep ice gully. It sits under massive hanging ice cliffs called seracs. These blocks of glacier ice are not stable features. They shift slowly under their own immense weight. They crack and splinter without any warning. When they release, everything below is completely exposed. The slope through this section tilts around 50 degrees. That is too steep for climbers to simply walk. They kick the front spikes of boots into ice. They lean forward for extremely long stretches. There are no comfortable shelves to stop and rest. The mountain forces movement step after careful step. Every team aiming for the summit must pass here. There is no wide alternate line that avoids it. The coordinated summit push depended strictly on timing. Leaders wanted teams leaving Camp 4 before midnight. The goal was to cross the bottleneck very early. They would reach the summit pyramid by midday. Then they would descend before afternoon warmth stacked risk. Overnight, cold usually locks the snow surface into crust. That firmness makes steep climbing much more predictable. Cold stability only helps if climbers move quickly. The rope-fixing team departed much later than originally planned. Missing manpower mattered greatly on this exact terrain. Fewer experienced fixers meant slower progress on steep ground. Rope fixing is not an optional detail on K2. Fixed lines act like a shared safety rail. Without them, following climbers stack up below steep sections. They wait in thin air while the clock moves. K2 exploits exactly that kind of slow pressure. Between midnight and early morning, the group moved upward. Headlamps cut narrow tunnels through the absolute dark. The upper slopes stayed locked in pre-dawn cold. Temperatures often dropped below minus 30 degrees Celsius. Surface snow was firm, almost like hard concrete. Avalanches and ice movement are quieter before solar heating. But extreme cold also slows human systems down. Every single movement costs more precious oxygen. Every pause drains heat from hands and feet. Teams counted on efficiency to balance those heavy costs. As climbers reached the bottleneck, the delay echoed upward. The advance rope work had not finished early. Following climbers did not flow smoothly through the choke point. They compressed into a tight line, and they waited. Waiting above 8,000 meters is never neutral. The body does not recover at that extreme height. At roughly 27,000 feet, the summit push slowed down. The ropes were installed too low on the mountain. Climbers reached exposed ground and found themselves waiting. Teams argued about rope supply in the thin air. The clock kept moving and the sun slid west. The massive ice wall stayed exactly where it sits. It hung directly over the only path down. The delay stretched minute by minute in the worst location. Movement slows sharply without those ropes securely in place. Slow movement heavily stretches a climber's limited oxygen use. It heavily stretches their exposure time on the face. The advance team began fixing ropes too early. They used large sections lower on the climbing route. Supply ran short exactly where speed mattered most. Climbers moving toward the bottleneck ran into long delays. Rope had to be repositioned constantly on the slope. Groups backtracked to strip lines from lower sections. They carried them much higher into the thin air. That process takes a very long time at 8,000 meters. The main summit group simply waited in the cold. The environment started quietly tightening the invisible vice. The hanging serac does not pause for delayed climbers. It continues to sit heavily under its own weight. The longer people remain exposed below, risk builds. Waiting is often much more dangerous than actually climbing. Standing in line extends the extreme risk window. Most teams plan turnaround times in the early afternoon. Many climbers vastly exceeded those windows on this day. Some reached the summit as late as 8 p.m. Summit fever influenced the slow narrowing of human judgment. Climbers had committed enormous effort to reach that point. Turning around did not feel like a neutral decision. Coordination became entirely fragmented across the multiple teams. K2 heavily punishes this kind of team fragmentation. In the bottleneck, everyone is tied to one timeline. If one group slows, everyone behind them slows down. That is exactly what began unfolding in August 2008. Delays, crowding, and late summit times stacked together. The environment always had the final vote on K2. Temperatures drop extremely quickly after the sun sets. Oxygen flow rates become critical as tired climbers slow. Headlamps replace daylight on the massive, steep mountain face. The later summit times push descents into total darkness. The mountain relies heavily on slow, quiet hazard accumulation. A small delay here and a thin oxygen margin there. Then the route compresses everyone into one exposed place. At 8 p.m., the summit is a trap door. The last climber reached the top in fading light. The day had already slipped entirely out of control. Down below, the bottleneck was still heavily packed. Fixed lines hung over steep ice like a bridge. People waited their turn in the absolute worst place. The overhanging serac hung, crept, and shed ice. Late summits mean the descent starts in complete darkness. Darkness on the upper mountain is near zero detail. The horizon can vanish and landmarks completely blur. The steep slope does not give you gentle errors. Misplacing a foot on steep ice carries immediate consequence. Headlamps do not turn K2's night into day. A beam of light shows only what it hits. Everything outside the beam becomes empty, terrifying black space. At 8:30 p.m., K2 did something that feels backward. It waited until the climb was basically over. People had crossed the traverse and turned downhill. That is when the Great Serac finally broke apart. A towering block of glacier ice released without warning. Massive ice came down into the bottleneck zone. The fall struck climbers nearly through the steep traverse. Norwegian climbers Lars Nessa and Cecilia Skog were there. K2 removed the one thing everyone counted on entirely. The falling chunks severed and scattered the fixed ropes. Those lines were the primary plan for getting down. When the ropes were cut, K2 deleted the rules. Climbers above were suddenly stranded without their primary lifelines. Stranded means facing a steep slope in the dark. The mountain forced a terrible choice on the survivors. Wait exposed while your failing body gets much weaker, or move without ropes on extremely hard, steep terrain. Neither option is good and both cost precious time. Climbers had no spare gear for free soloing such terrain. Free soloing means moving carefully without a safety rope. Every single slip has absolutely no backup system. Many climbers were forced into an unplanned overnight bivouac. It means staying where you are because moving is worse. A pause above 8,000 meters is a slow drain. Lungs keep pumping and hands keep rapidly cooling down. At around 8,300 meters, the rope simply ends. The fixed ropes were no longer there for guidance. The slope tilted at about a 60-degree angle. One mistake means a fall of more than a kilometer. Several survivors were forced to free, down-climb the ice. They used only crampons and ice axes for balance. K2 quietly turned a guided descent into a survival test. Survivors moved carefully, using a technique called front pointing. They kicked front spikes into the extremely steep slope. They drove the axe pick deeply into the surface. It is highly precise work, even in clear daylight. They were forced to do it in complete darkness. Headlamps became their absolute only visual reference point. Each step had to be short and completely deliberate. Gravity constantly pulled heavily at their heavy climbing boots. The mountain remained fully active during this entire descent. Air stayed thin enough to dull critical physical coordination. Hands fumble more easily and foot placement becomes sloppy. At roughly 1 a.m., one headlamp turned the wrong direction. Pemba Gyalje Sherpa had just reached Camp 4 safely. He descended alone using a tattered remnant rope. Then the radio crackled with a deeply alarming message. Marco Confortola was still midway up in the bottleneck. He was confused, frostbitten, and fading from altitude sickness. Pemba turned around and started climbing back up. He went back into the completely unstable ice chute. It was a free solo effort with no fixed line. Pemba climbed into a zone littered with fresh debris. He reached Confortola and revived him using bottled oxygen. He began guiding him downward through the steep bottleneck. Confortola was not simply tired, he was severely disoriented. Severe altitude sickness heavily affects the brain's core functions. Further CIRAC activity occurred around 2:30 a.m. Several climbers attempting unprotected descents were swept away. Pemba and Confortola survived at the base. Higher on the route, climbers remained totally exposed. Sherpas Tsering and Pasang Bhote assisted stranded Korean climbers. Minutes later came a third massive ice collapse. It swept through the highly unstable upper bottleneck area. Pasang, his cousin Jumik Bhote, and 2 Koreans were lost. The route itself was completely breaking down around them. Pemba could not go back up the slope again. He continued safely downward with Marco Confortola. By morning, 11 climbers had sadly lost their lives. The list stretches across teams and vital mountain roles. It includes Pakistani porters Jahan, Shaheen, and Jahan Baig. Serbian climbers Dren Mandic and Dusan Perovic did not survive. Norwegian climbers Rolf Bay and Lars Nesse were lost. South Korean climbers Hwang Dong-jin and Kim Hyo-gyeong were lost. Park Hyung-duk and Song Won-bin did not survive the night. Nepali Sherpas Jumik Bhote and Pasang Bhote were lost. Following 2008, leaders began tightening their own internal protocols. Expedition leaders began setting extremely firm turnaround cutoffs. Pre-stocked rope caches at Camp 4 became more common. There was stronger emphasis on shared radio communication channels. Unified leadership for rope fixing became a heavy focus. These safety improvements rely entirely on informal team cooperation. There was absolutely no global rulebook imposed on K2. The mountain remains largely unregulated by any governing authority. Equipment improves, planning improves, and communication constantly gets better. But the physical structure of K2 remains exactly the same. The Great Serac does not recognize new safety policies. The Abruzzi Spur still narrows traffic into single lines. Every single season, K2 keeps testing new climbing teams. It still stands exactly where it did in 2008. The Great Serac creeps forward by gravity, millimeter by millimeter. The mountain controls the clock, closing the window slowly. It waits patiently for teams to misjudge timing again.